but I am
Sorry.
delighted to be here, and thank you, Paula, for inviting me. So yeah, I was going to speak to you a little bit this evening. It's not going to be like a formal presentation or anything, but I thought that it would be a good idea for me to tell you a little bit about how I became involved in Serve, what I did since I was involved in Serve, and where I am now, which kind of actually brings me right back to the reason I got involved in Serve in the first place. So I qualified as a solicitor in Belfast in 2007. I went into a sort of medium-sized practice where I was doing civil litigation, as we call it, whippers, trippers, and slippers. So claims work, basically. And I think that I always had a sense in my head, like many people who go into law do, that I really want to try and help people, and that's a crux of why a lot of people get into law. Now, you tend in law to go in different directions depending on sort of where you happen to get a job, where you might then your interests might lead you. But ultimately, I think for a lot of people, it comes down to helping other people. And this is probably a bit too much information, but I went through a heartbreak when I was in my early years of qualification as a solicitor. And after spending about 3 weeks crying my eyes out and thinking, you know, this is terrible. I came to the decision that I was actually not going to sit in the house and cry any longer. And I went outside again into the world, and I came across an advertisement for Serve, which is looking for volunteers. So I went along to the information evening, and the following year, having applied for one of the programs, I went to Brazil for 4 weeks with Serve on a house building project. And that was when I was first really introduced to the whole concept of development education, because it wasn't really part of my background, not really part of law or the training or anything I'd done. So I think that was the first real introduction to what I think we then knew as, oh my God, is that Burnham? Hello. How are you? Lovely to see you. Oh gosh, I wasn't expecting you to join the call this evening, so sorry, I was just taken aback, but great to see you.
Neither was I. So, hi, Burnham. That's a great surprise.
Hi, Burnham.
Yeah, brilliant. Burnham,
For
we're
every-
just starting to you're on mute at the minute. But yeah, I just was starting to introduce my my involvement in Serve, and how it started with going to Brazil, very first off to do a house building project, and then I suppose first introductions to development education, a lot of new words, new concepts, and it probably the introduction that I had, and maybe this is more a reflection on me, it didn't really sink in, to be quite honest with you. Because for me, I wanted to go do something good, come back home again. And, you know, I think like a lot of the negative impressions of volunteering, maybe that sense of, oh, I've done my bit now kind of thing. And then I'll go back to my wee quiet and comfortable life. But the experience was so good that I wanted to do it again, but I wanted to do it for a bit longer. So I came back to Serve and I said, look, is there anything, you know, you can organize for me to get a bit more of an experience? Not sure if I'm ready to leave home for a year, but I would love to go for a little bit longer than a month. So Chris, who was there at the time, basically got me organized with a placement in Young Africa in Mozambique. So I went there in 2013, and I was still working in my legal practice, and the firm was great. They gave me some time off. They even paid for my flight because they were that kind of sort of firm that wanted to support this type of work. But unfortunately for them, I came back with more questions than answers. My time in Mozambique was absolutely amazing. The experience, people, meeting Burnham, and leading the volunteers. It was absolutely brilliant. And Young Africa in Mozambique, where I was placed in Beira, has a hostel for girls on site. So in the compound where I was living, there was a hostel for girls. And then the college itself is all about vocational training programs for school leavers. So I got to know so many of the people there, the teachers, the students, and had a really wonderful experience. But I did encounter when I was there some challenging aspects of the work as well. And I sort of learned that there was quite a bit of sort of, I don't think there's any other word for it other than sort of bribery and corruption in my experience. So I'd heard stories about, you know, don't be going out for a drive without some cash in case you're stopped by the police. And it was called almost assumed that, you know, that you would have to pay an element to get on with your day, or, you know, to avoid being arrested and held in prison. And there were a couple of other things that I just thought, oh my goodness, like this is, I suppose, so it was more prevalent than what I had ever thought that it would be. And it was a real sort of, as I say, a sort of one of those things that just kept ruminating on me when I came back. And so instead of coming back and really settling down into my practice, I really couldn't stop thinking about it and thinking about, why is that the case? What has led to it? Why is it almost embedded in the society? Why is it accepted? And then what are the implications of this for trying to build equal and fair societies? And so speaking with a secretary who's working in the firm, very quiet woman, but very, very perceptive, she had said to me, you know, whenever you talk about your time in Mozambique, your eyes light up. And when you talk about your work here in this firm, they don't. And she was the sort of giving me the gentle nudge, because I sort of, in a way, I came back with my head so muddled that I didn't think that I could actually spend any more time thinking about it, because it seemed like such a huge problem that what was I ever going to do or be able to contribute that would make any difference. And I had actually been told about this before I went to Mozambique, that when you spend a long time away on some of these placements, it can actually impact, you know, how you feel about the global situation, which almost seems impossibly unfair. And so I wanted to kind of push it away, but this secretary, my friend Lorraine, was very, as I say, gently nudging me in the right direction. So as a result of that, then I decided to enroll in a master's in human rights. And it was an area of practice that I hadn't really been involved in up to that point. As I say, it was civil litigation, and then my volunteering was like an aside. But then I thought, okay, well, I do love my profession. I love what I'm doing. I love law in a sense. I'm a bit of a nerd in that way. But I do want to use it in ways that might have an impact on some of the injustices that I could see. So I went back and did a master's in human rights law at Queen's part-time when I was working at the firm. And my subject, because it was shortly after the really terrible crisis of the Mediterranean in 2015, where there was, you know, 33,000 deaths one summer. And I know that it's still a crisis, and probably it's growing again in terms of the numbers of people who are dying as they try to cross the Mediterranean and in other places. But I chose that as my subject, and I chose specifically the UK government's legal obligations towards unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, because I thought I'll pick an area where there really is no defence to the government's position of not providing them with the legal protections that under international law they're supposed to be providing. And lo and behold, shortly after I finished my master's, at which point I had decided I really wanted to go into this area of practice, but I also had decided that I wasn't going into a private law firm, because private law firms are businesses and they are about fee generation. And it's not, I don't think it's the best way to practice in that area of law, because it's not about making money for me. And so I had decided I wasn't going to go into private practice, and lo and behold, a job became available at the Children's Law Centre in Belfast, representing unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in their asylum and trafficking cases. And it was a big jump for me, because I suppose I had been on a course without really knowing it to becoming partner in the firm that I was in. And this was then moving into what we call the community and voluntary sector, where salaries are way, 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 way lower. The work is probably harder. It's more emotionally draining. But ultimately, it was definitely the right move for me. And so I took the jump just before the COVID pandemic. I spent 3 weeks in my new office and my new surrounding in my brand new area of law and practice. And then we were all sent home to work from behind a laptop. So I spent the next sort of few weeks and months trying to really get myself up to speed in this area of law, which is very complicated, very technical. And ultimately, I think that the stakes are so high. You know, I had started to meet some of these young people just before I was working from home, but then online. And the vulnerability that was so clearly visible, but also that was obvious through their claims and the stories and the experiences which they had, made me, I suppose, want to do as good a job as possible, but also very concerned if I didn't get it right and they weren't granted asylum. A steep learning curve, very challenging, but hugely rewarding. And certainly it affirmed for me that I had made the right move into practice in human rights law. I probably took on a little bit too much in terms of the number of cases that I was dealing with. And I think I'd come from a mindset of you can always do more, you can always do more. But what I realized, and probably maybe a little bit too late, that I couldn't do the number of cases that I had time for. I could only do the number of cases that I was mentally capable of actually taking on. And you know, I think that I probably realized that after I had passed a point of getting too emotionally involved in the cases. And so after a couple of years, another opportunity arose and I decided to take it just because it was a step back from the client-facing work, which at that point in time, I don't think I was doing the best job for my clients because I was so emotionally involved. So I was going into meetings, I was becoming emotional on their behalf, and that's not what they needed. They needed someone to stand up for their rights and represent them. And so I decided that when a job came up with an organization called PILS Project, or it's now PILS Only, which is Public Interest Litigation Support, I thought that this was actually a very good next step because the cases that I was dealing with, they were about individual asylum applications. And what I found was each time I had an argument with the Home Office, for example, the next time it came along, I would have to have the exact same argument. So for me, with working in strategic litigation, which is all about trying to take one case that changes the law for everybody coming afterwards, then that would be hopefully more beneficial so that less people would have to have the same argument. So that's effectively strategic litigation. The aim of that is to change the law for others coming behind. So that was working across a whole broad spectrum of human rights and equality issues, but it was focused on Northern Ireland, or it is focused on Northern Ireland, and it's about helping community groups and law firms bring strategic litigation cases across a range of human rights and equality issues. So I was working on climate justice, social housing, education, troubles-related matters. And again, that was a great sort of step for me at the time. But also it gave me that little bit of a step back. And sometimes I actually feel guilty that I couldn't do more than what I did do with the Children's Law Centre. But I think that for the longevity of me working in this area, it was the right move. And then last year, an organisation that I'd been following since I was a student called Irish Rule of Law International advertised for the position that I'm in now, which is Executive Director. And I had been following them for so many years because what Irish Rule of Law International does is that they use the expertise of lawyers and justice sector actors, so police, prosecution, judges, and you know, other people who've been involved in the justice system to support resource-constrained countries across the world. And that made so much sense to me because it was about sort of using what we have in this country in terms of expertise and experience to support rule of law systems around the world. And I'll come on a little bit later to the sort of the big question for us in terms of what we want to do as an organization. But I'll just start by sort of giving a little bit of an introduction to the work that we do. And I suppose rule of law is in our name, so it's a key aspect of our work. And I think that links us very closely to the SDG 16, which has three main components to it: promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable institutions at all levels. So I think our work probably focuses more so on the second and third strands of SDG 16, although I think that all helps to promote peaceful and inclusive societies. But I suppose the rule of law is one of those things that's very difficult to define. But as lawyers, a lot of us, people who work in human rights law, know kind of instinctively what it is, but people have different definitions, and there actually is no one set rule of law structure that can or even should be applied from one society to another. The important thing is that the system that is in place in a society or in a country has the backing of the people who have put the people there to put that system in place. So basically, it requires the integrity of being supported by the people that it's serving. So that's the first element for me. The other aspects to it are that it's a way in which public bodies can be held accountable. So there's that separation of powers between the judiciary and the legislature and the government. So the government are equally held up by this system. The president could be held equally accountable to any person, as a member of the society, and that's another fundamental principle. And ultimately, this helps kind of uphold the democracy and protect the rights of all the citizens and people living within that society. I'll talk a wee bit later at the end about what's happening with the rule of law at the minute. But before I do, I just want to say how we use our work to try and support and promote those rule of law systems. So Irish Rule of Law International is all about capacity and institution building and supporting. So what does that mean? That means effectively that we use lawyers from here, but also from other countries, to go into institutions which are supporting the rule of law and to kind of help build in whatever way they decide they want to go. So it's not about, and it's funny because we have this question mark about our name, and I think in some of the countries that we're working in, we're known as Irish Rule of Law, which kind of almost suggests that it's about the rule of law here, and what we say, we're saying that you should use that, in your country, but that's absolutely not what it is. We listen to the countries that we work with, and many of them are based on common law systems. A lot of them are former colonies of Britain, and they have similar systems to the Irish legal system. And we support those institutions. So we have access to justice programs in all of the countries that we work in. And we have projects currently in Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi. Now, in Tanzania and Zambia, those are newer projects, and we don't have any staff in country. But what we do is we partner with institutions there, and we will then build training programs around the needs of the country, and working closely with the justice sector actors there. So with the judiciary, with the public prosecution service or the equivalent of it. And then we will bring in experts from Ireland and Northern Ireland, the jurisdiction of Northern Ireland, and then deliver training, which the idea is then that it will be cascaded. So we deliver what's called training of trainers course, so that those who are trained can then go into their institutions or to their colleagues and deliver that training. And the idea then is it's not just about us delivering, it's about actually supporting the building of knowledge and expertise, so that can be cascaded out. But our flagship program is Malawi, where we have currently 9, soon to be 10 staff. And we place lawyers within the institutions that we work with. So we have a program lawyer working with the judiciary, with the police, with the Legal Aid Bureau, and we also have a child diversion program. And I'll give you an example because this is sort of all words and jargon at the minute. But one of the best examples, I think, which demonstrates what the access to justice aspect of our work is, it's called camp courts. So in Malawi and in Zambia and in many other countries, there's a huge problem with overcrowding in prisons. That is as a result of many, many things. But ultimately, the systems aren't able to deal with the number of cases that they're getting. So buildings that were built for, 2,000 people are maybe housing 8,000 people, or, something. So I think the capacity is currently 250% in Malawi's prisons. So that in and of itself is leading to a number of human rights abuses. So if you can imagine that prisoners don't have proper places to sleep, they're not getting the right food, there's disease, there's hunger, there's lots of implications as a result of this capacity problem. And so one way of trying to tackle that is to introduce camp courts, because the problem, I think, is largely a logistical one. How do you get prisoners from the prison to the court? And so what it has meant is that many, many prisoners have been put in prison on allegations of crime, different criminal acts, but have never actually been in front of a judge because the system's not able to cope with the number of people there. And so what camp courts do is that they effectively bring the court to the prison. So we work with legal aid lawyers, we work with the judiciary, and we set it up so that a number of prisoners are listed on a particular day. A magistrate will go through their cases, and it's not about the full hearing, but it's about maybe a bail application, or maybe it's to do with reviewing the case to see if it's ready to be listed and getting it listed. So it's about moving the process on, but it's also about giving rights to those prisoners who have rights, but it's actually giving them access to it, because if they can't see a judge, they can never ask for bail, but they may well be entitled to it. And this is hopefully, well, it is addressing some of the issues around overcapacity in prisons. And so I went to Malawi recently to see our program, and one of the camp courts was set up for me to see. And it was, it really only sinks in when you see these things in action. But ultimately, there was a room full of, it was all men. There was no women in the prison, but it was men and a couple of under 18s as well. And out of the 34 that were listed that day, 16 were released from prison, including 2 who were discharged completely because they had been in prison longer than the sentence they would have been given if they had have got to court and been found guilty. And even though they never even had a case, they were never found guilty. They had actually spent the time in prison that they would have been punished with if they had been found guilty. So I think that's it's a really obvious example of how we're supporting the rule of law structure. And it's also, I suppose, brings me back to serve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I suppose the reason that I got into serve in the first place, it feels like very, very tangible work that we're doing. But there are sort of question marks as well, because firstly, the rule of law is under threat around the world. And, recent studies have shown that the rule of law performances of countries around the world is actually decreasing. And, we can see ourselves what's happening with America, where, the government is not being held accountable, can't be held accountable because it's overriding the laws that it made. So there's all those sorts of things going on. And it also has very practical implications. So USAID recently pulled out of the funding of many of its development programs around the world, including Malawi. And even though we're not funded directly by USAID, we do work with partners who are funded by it, but also we work in a country which is very much reliant on development work in the country to prop up the economy, or not prop it up, but certainly contribute massively to the economy. So the ramifications of countries changing their policies in relation to foreign aid is really, really hugely impactful on these countries. But that in and of itself also raises the whole question of development and reliance on, say, foreign aid and what it is we as international NGOs are actually doing in countries where we're working. So are we actually creating sustainable, societies, or are we kind of falsely creating spaces where when that's taken away, actually we haven't maybe done any good at all? And I mean, that's been a bit extreme, and I'm not saying that anybody is not doing any good, but when you look at the underlying systems, are we actually supporting the capacity of the individual countries? So that we're about to go through a strategic review process, and the big question for us, and particularly from the Malawi team who have now worked in the country, it's Irish lawyers, and now it's half Malawian staff as well, which is great because we're starting to, I suppose, I don't know, Paula, if you've gone into the concept of localization, but effectively that it's about a lot of the international NGOs are now focused on the localization. So it's not about us giving the expertise, it's about having the expertise within the local community. And that is a big question. I think it's an existential question, probably for many international NGOs, but certainly something that we'll be looking at, because what do we want to do? Do we want to go in and continually be there and do work there? Or do we want to try and create the systems whereby actually we don't need to stay there forever? We can go in, support, help build up, but actually give the power and the organization to local people. So it's something that we'll be looking at a bit more closely later this year as part of our strategic planning process. But I suppose just to finish off, and I could probably keep rambling, and I hope some of it made sense and came out in a way you could follow. But I know that you're sort of, maybe some of you at the start of your journey with SERVE, and this concept of development education might be still sinking in with you. It took me a while, I have to say, and I think it's one of those things that keeps making more sense to me the more I do my work, and the more I engage thoughtfully with what's actually happening around the world. But I would say that no matter what you're studying, where you're thinking about working, there are so many opportunities to become involved in being part of the solution. Whether you're an accountant, whether you're doing law, whether you're doing engineering, climate work, whatever it might be. And I think I am proof of the fact that, you don't necessarily have to sort of move to different places around the world to do the work. You can actually do it here, and you can be a support to many organizations and societies around the world. And the partnership model that SERVE operates, I think, is so key, because it's not about going in and doing work and saying, right, we know what you need, we'll provide it, but actually it's what would you like us, or how can we help, and about partnering up. And then the capacity thing and building that strong foundation, I think, is really fundamental. And hopefully I can continue to play a small part in that. But I'm going to finish up there, Paula. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.